Day 1024 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 760,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,390 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 3 tanks, 31 APVs, and 6 artillery. Then as for a bit of a change of pace Friday, let's take a look at the territory of control stats. Because since last week, Russia has captured 0.01% of Ukrainian land, with that 1/100th of a percentage point spread across the entire front line at various places, with figures like these continuing to effectively seem to amount to Russia's own demilitarization and, just as importantly, Russia's economic deterioration. All for some temporary minuscule gains. Hardly seems fair for regular Russians who will be paying for this war for generations to come. Then headed across to the map all the way to Novosibirsk, which almost feels like deja vu, because 3,000 kilometers away from the front lines, a significant fire has engulfed a Russian army supply warehouse, with flames spreading over 7,000 square meters. Eyewitness videos and photos were circulating online showing thick smoke and intense fire, raising questions about the cause. Was it careless smoking, bad luck, partisans, drones, insurance scam related, or just another example of the Russian army's legendary safety protocols? Then briefly to Russia's Rostov region, that continues to take a beating, with more Russian reports, specifically once again at Tagnarog, on the occurrence of very powerful explosions in the early morning, but also fresh reports of Ukrainian forces targeting the Novoshitinsk oil refinery in the Rostov region, once again using unmanned aerial vehicles. No further confirmations or pictures on this event just yet. Then to Ukraine, to the wider Ukraine, because after a brief lull of 3 nights, the country saw an uptick in Russian drone and missile activity earlier this morning, where the latest data shows that Ukrainian F-16s, alongside their cruise missile shootdowns, continue to climb, now making up for roughly 12% of total intercepts, with the wider wave of attacks constituting about a 85 to 90% interception rate for Russian missiles during this latest event. So this latest Russian attack clearly represents the commencement of their winter wave of attacks across the country of Ukraine, with Ukrainians moving back into underground shelters, spirits unbroken, with Russia spending roughly $150 to $200 million worth of ordnance in this morning's attack, and that's just a rough estimate for the moment. It could indeed be more. And yet, the Russian attack waves never made a meaningful difference or outcome in the past, with some expectation we have now that Ukraine will respond in kind to these events. Then to zoom into a couple of points on the map, in a notable development from the very eastern front lines of the Kharkiv region, at Kapanki, a cleanup operation led by the AFU Assault Brigade resulted in what we saw was the capture of 5 soldiers from the Russian 1st Tank Army. These soldiers were located hiding in a cellar, and during their capture they unexpectedly began discussing their families in Ukraine, raising eyebrows about their circumstances. So what we're looking at here is Russian soldiers hiding as their military is invading a country they have family in. Putin hasn't exactly set up this war to allow for good morale within their own army's ranks. Then headed down the map to the ongoing battles near Hanivka, south of Kharkova, where Ukrainian soldiers are currently facing a precarious situation as they find themselves dealing with potential encirclement or withdrawal. Reports indicate that Russian forces are maneuvering near to behind Ukrainian lines, posing a significant threat, although it remains uncertain whether they have fully established an area of seized control or a foothold. Russian control does appear to be increasing in Uspenivka, leaving the question of can the AFU support this front in its current unfolding dynamic, or is it just time to get the flaming crows out of there? Though I'm sure the situation will probably be updated to show this position is closed right after I upload this video, or on or after the weekend. But it does remain to be seen, and this in fact is a really recent update in just the last couple of hours, suggesting that a little bit more time needs to pass before something actually changes in this region. Then looking on the map, so here we see a Ukrainian fiber optic FPV strike on a Russian vehicle, apparently, where reports from Russians on the ground showed the destruction of one of their Buhanka vehicles, where they themselves stated that it was a Ukrainian fiber optic lined FPV drone deployed in targeting the vehicle. Now, Ukraine has been known to somewhat, maybe seldomly, work with this type of wired platform, which is a method of communication designed to counter signal jamming. But this drone type sometimes does have its range and entanglement limitations, though it is something that Russia has reportedly started using more and more out of sheer necessity for their mainstay wireless drones, lacking the flexibility in terms of signal hopping and lack of onboard FPV autonomy. Then headed across to some news, as France appears to have doubled down, as the French ambassador to Ukraine stated that the usage of their Storm Shadow/Scalp supplied missiles to Ukraine that are used on the territory of the Russian Federation are legitimate targets. And this news story is in alignment with the 50% drop in Russian attacks performed by aviation-launched FAB munitions ever since Western partners allowed Ukraine to target Russia with ATACMS and Storm Shadows. And I'd have to say that would be at least a 50% drop, with what looks to be a 60 to 70% drop in real terms from former 7-day average highs found in October and November. And looking at this chart, right here is where the ATACMS and Storm Shadows rolled out onto Russian military assets. As such, this drop is largely expected to be due to the increased threat posed by Ukraine's now longer range missile capabilities, likely leading to Russian aircraft now having no choice but to operate further afield from those front lines, with even some reports suggesting that Russian jets moved over 600 kilometers away to avoid potential strikes, which certainly goes a long way to impact their operational efficiency and sortie rates. As a result, the once seemingly relentless barrages of those Russian aviation strikes has been markedly curtailed. Oh, noting also that weather appears to have little effect on the observed drop, because a 2-day warming period of exceptionally viable weather for these aviation salvos had no positive impact on the cab usage, right at the time when this lowering frequency had occurred. So it is very interesting to note. Then to some more news, as the US Department of Defense has officially announced a new military aid package to Ukraine, designated as part of the Presidential Drawdown Authority, totaling $500 million. This latest support includes a mix of ammunition, anti-radar missiles, and various vehicles like MRAPs and Humvees, a veritable smorgasbord for military needs. In detail, though, the package features ammunition specifically designed to counter UAV threats, plus HIMARS artillery rounds, and undisclosed amounts of 155mm artillery shells. And given that the US upped its 155mm production from a pre-war level of about 14,000 units per month, leading to now moving up to about 50,000 units per month, roughly the same as Europe, then I would expect that the amount of shells undisclosed for Ukraine received in this package would constitute a higher than typical average volume, which in the past has been anywhere between 8,000 and 25,000 shells. Then to some more news, and in a recent meeting in Beijing, Russian official Dmitry Medvedev stated that Russia is open to resuming negotiations with Ukraine, provided Kyiv acknowledges current realities and considers proposals made by President Putin. And these are the types of proposals that severely impact Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping weighed in on the situation, emphasizing the urgent need for de-escalation in Ukraine. He urged both parties to avoid actions that could further inflame tensions, reiterating his country's stance on maintaining peace by adhering to what he said was 3 key principles, which was to prevent the expansion of the combat zone, avoid escalation of armed conflict, and steering clear of provocations that could heighten hostilities. Although China really needs to amp up with more than just words to get the vote of confidence internationally in this regard. Meanwhile, some observers, myself included, couldn't help but notice a curious mark on Medvedev's forehead during the meeting, where perhaps Putin gave him a real shiner after Medvedev broke the rules on the no more nuclear threats for the foreseeable future policy, which is a Putin policy I say exists from a speculative standpoint, though it does appear to align with what's been coming out of the Kremlin's and Medvedev's mouth more recently. Though as for the shiner on the forehead, it could have just as easily been a drunken fall from this former seat-warming, one-term Russian president. Then headed across to what I should probably start calling the Russian economy blunder segment, as the Russian debt market is facing a significant amount of stress, particularly within the real estate sector, which is leading the charge into bankruptcy. Recent stock charts of the two largest developers reveal a steep decline in bond prices, with yields skyrocketing to 40 to 50%, which typically happens when the price of the bonds drops sharply, reflecting increased risk or reduced confidence in the issuer's ability to repay the debt. This downturn can be tracked back to the war with Ukraine, which drastically altered lending practices. So before 2022, preferential loans made up only 30% of the market, but that figure has now surged to 80% as the state attempts to prop up the faltering sector. Despite these efforts, and in some ways because of them, inflation has spiraled, with prices increasing at alarming rates. The central bank's attempts to stabilize the situation by raising the key interest rate and tightening preferential loan programs have only exacerbated the crisis. Now, this chart shows one of, if not the largest real estate developer in the Russian market, known as Samolet, with not really a great deal to suggest that the 2021 spike on the left of the chart has any potential for reoccurring after the SMO has increasingly devastated the Russian economy. And so, what can Russia do to circumvent these economic woes? Well, deputies from the Just Russia party have introduced a bill aimed at the early dismissal of Nabiullina, the head of the Central Bank of Russia. That's right, get rid of perhaps the most economically competent individual that exists in a key position in Russia, who I feel sorry for. She always looks constantly stressed, as if she's stuck between a rock and a hard place. And she is. Now, these calls to get rid of Nabiullina essentially blame her for the failures of the economy, even though it's pretty obvious to most, and I would think certainly obvious to Russian State Duma members, that the real cause of the economic disaster that they face is due to Putin's foreign policy, shall we say. And I must add, it is all very strange, as it always is in Russia, because just days prior, officials were confidently asserting that the economy was on an upwards trajectory, with dismissing concerns regarding the economic pain points the country faces. And so there's really no sector untouched within Russian society these days, because in a recent memo of appeal, state-owned Russian Railways is grappling with significant staff shortages across the country. In an effort to fill the gaps, authorities are reaching out to retired railroad workers, including locomotive drivers, urging them to return to the job. Now, just a couple of months ago, they supposedly fixed this shortage with migrant workers, where at the time I made a half-joke comment about Russian Railways doubling as a recruiting agency for the SMO. But now all of this has left me wondering just how true that really was. Then headed across to a quick funny to round it all off with today, guys. So this one's in fact a follow-on from yesterday, because those golf buggies we saw en route somewhere within Russia, well, it appears we found their purpose, because in a surprising twist on Russian military training, Russia has inaugurated a quote-unquote school of extreme driving as servicemen perform various obstacle driving exercises. The goal? To prepare assault detachments for rapid movement during combat operations and provide supplies, all while catching the enemy off guard. I've even got the golf buggy instructor's statement right here to that effect, where he says, quote, "Assault detachments use motor vehicles to carry out assault combat actions, deliver ammunition and food to strongholds. The vehicles allow assaultmen to move quickly and take the enemy unawares." So, the only person that's unawares is the instructor, who clearly has no clue how ineffective these buggies are when positioned near to or on the front lines. And this, folks, is what passes for world-class military strategy in the Russian 21st century. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe. Thanks once again for all of the support. It really helps out the channel. And I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!